They marched with black boots polished like mirrors, their uniforms pressed to perfection. The skull insignia glared from their caps, and the lightning bolts of their collar patches cut through the darkness like jagged blades. This was the image of the Schutzstaffel, the SS. To civilians across occupied Europe, they were not soldiers in the traditional sense, but predators dressed in black. They carried with them an aura of terror, as though death itself had been given a uniform. When the SS entered a village, the air thickened with dread. Children vanished into barns, women clutched crucifixes, and men who dared to look them in the eye often never returned. For years, the SS spread fear across an entire continent. They had been the enforcers of the Reich's most brutal policies, architects of massacres and extermination. To the victims, they seemed untouchable, above the reach of justice. Yet history has a way of turning hunters into prey. As the tide of war shifted, and the Red Army pressed westward, the question emerged with a chilling inevitability. What would happen when the feared SS fell into Soviet hands? The answer was written not in treaties or conventions, but in blood and fire. For the Soviet Union, this was no ordinary war. It was the Great Patriotic War, a struggle for survival against an invader who had unleashed unspeakable horror on their soil. Every burned village, every orphaned child, every mass grave dug into the frozen earth of Belarus or Ukraine was etched into memory. To the Soviets, the SS were not combatants, deserving the protections of prisoners of war. They were criminals, executioners, beasts, in human form, and when the tide turned, there would be no mercy. From the beginning, the Soviet approach was not improvised vengeance, but deliberate retribution. The Red Army carried lists, intelligence files, and orders handed down from the highest levels of command. SS men were to be separated immediately from regular German soldiers, where ordinary Wehrmacht troops might face the grim uncertainty of prison camps. The SS could expect humiliation, torment, and death. It was systematic, it was organized, and it was unrelenting. The roots of this fury lay in the atrocities committed across the East. Villages like Kaidan, wiped off the map in flames, with every inhabitant slaughtered. Columns of refugees, machine-gunned on the roadside. Mass graves stretching as far as the eye could see, filled with Jews, partisans, and civilians whose only crime was existing under German occupation. Entire cities reduced to ash and rubble by policies of deliberate annihilation. The SS were the face of this terror, the ones who gave the orders and pulled the triggers. The Soviet people did not forget, and they did not forgive. As the war turned in 1943, the first real chance for revenge presented itself. At Kursk, in the largest tank battle the world had ever seen, the Red Army faced not only German armor but the elite Waffen-SS divisions. These units had been trained as the spearhead of the Reich, brutal in discipline and merciless in execution. They believed themselves invincible. Yet when the smoke cleared and the Soviet counteroffensive surged forward, many of these SS soldiers found themselves encircled, wounded, or captured. It was here that the unbreakable aura of the SS began to crack. Reports spread of Soviet soldiers dragging SS prisoners aside, stripping them of their proud black uniforms, and forcing them to crawl in the dirt before execution squads. The humiliation was deliberate, meant to break the myth of superiority. Where the Wehrmacht prisoners might be herded into columns and marched to the rear, the SS were marked for something different. A different fate entirely. Word of this treatment spread quickly through the German ranks. Fear of falling into Soviet hands became so great that many SS men carried a single bullet reserved for themselves, a final escape from capture. Others attempted to hide their blood group tattoos, the small ink marks on their arms that identified them as SS. Some cut the skin with knives, others burned the flesh with cigarettes. But often, it was too late. The Red Army knew where to look, and once the mark was found, the prisoner's future was sealed. But this was only the beginning. The full scale of retribution would come later, as the Soviets advanced deeper into Eastern Europe, liberating cities and uncovering camps. Each discovery fueled the fury. Each liberation revealed new horrors. For every corpse pulled from a pit, for every survivor trembling with trauma, the resolve hardened. Justice would not be found in courtrooms. It would be delivered on the battlefield, in cellars, in forests, and in camps, built not for survival, but for death. As the Red Army crossed the borders into German-occupied Poland and Ukraine, the policy became ever more explicit. Soviet officers carried orders to classify all SS members as war criminals. Unlike regular soldiers, they were not to be exchanged or repatriated. Their destiny was punishment, and punishment meant death. Some were shot in fields outside the villages they had burned. Others were transported east in cattle cars, condemned to the slow death of labor camps where starvation and exhaustion completed what bullets had not. The hunters had indeed become the hunted, and the world was about to witness what it meant when an empire of terror collapsed under the weight of its own crimes. But the story does not end here. This is only the beginning. In the battles to come, in the cities of Kharkov, Majdanek, and finally Berlin itself, the vengeance of the Red Army would take on forms more chilling than the SS could have imagined. And as we step into those moments of capture, interrogation, and execution, one question lingers in the air. How far did Soviet justice go in its pursuit of retribution? The war on the Eastern Front was not fought with illusions. The Soviets knew precisely who their formant enemy was, and they remembered everything. Entire generations had been scarred by the sight of their villages in flames, their families cut down, their comrades left in shallow pits of frozen earth. The scars of Leningrad's siege, the ruins of Stalingrad, the fields of Belarus soaked in blood, none of it could be forgotten. The Red Army did not march westward as liberators alone. They marched as avengers. And when the SS fell into their grip, vengeance was merciless. For the Soviets, this was not war in the sense of armies meeting on equal terms. It was punishment for crimes that demanded retribution. Soviet command made this distinction clear. The Wehrmacht, however brutal its campaigns, was still treated as a military adversary. The SS were something else entirely. They were executioners in uniform, the perpetrators of mass killings and scorched earth policies. They were seen not as prisoners of war, but as condemned men walking. At Prokhorovka, during the ferocious battles that followed Kursk, Soviet troops captured several Waffen-SS fighters. They were quickly separated from the regular prisoners. Survivors later recalled how Soviet soldiers forced them to kneel, stripped them of their boots and belts, and mocked the once proud elite soldiers as cowards. They were not marched to camps. They were lined up against barns, their pleas drowned out by the rattle of Soviet rifles. In that moment, Prokhorovka was not just a battlefield. It became a place of judgment. In Kharkov, the pattern deepened. After the brutal fighting that saw the city change hands multiple times, the Soviets interrogated, captured SS officers. One officer, whose name has been lost to history, was said to have admitted, under questioning, that he had overseen mass shootings of civilians, the destruction of entire villages, and the execution of partisans without trial. His words were written down not for the purpose of trial but as a confession before death. Once his role was confirmed, he was executed, his body discarded without ceremony. Justice had been delivered swiftly, without the long debates of international law. The vengeance extended beyond the battlefields. In the town of Travniki, more than 100 SS instructors who had trained auxiliary guards for the death camps were rounded up. These men had taught others how to herd prisoners, how to shoot efficiently, how to keep the machinery of genocide in motion. They were crammed into cattle cars and shipped east into Siberia. There, under conditions of cold, hunger, and endless labor, almost none survived. By the end of the war, the survival rate for those men was nearly zero. At Majdanek, the reckoning was even more symbolic. When Soviet forces liberated the camp, they found evidence of mass killings that stunned even hardened veterans. Piles of shoes, mounds of ash, gas chambers, still smelling of death. 17 SS guards who had served there were captured. Rather than being shot on sight, they were marched into the very gas chambers they once operated. The doors closed behind them, and for the first time, the SS felt the suffocating terror they had inflicted on millions. The Soviets had turned their own weapon against them, and then came Berlin. The final act of the war brought the reckoning to the very heart of the Reich. As the Red Army stormed into the capital, Marshal Georgy Zhukov issued a chilling order: no prisoners among the SS. In the chaos of the last battles, when German soldiers tried to surrender, those wearing the black insignia were pulled aside, lined up against walls, and executed in cellars and courtyards. In the ruins of the Reich Chancellery itself, dozens of SS men were shot in the same bunkers where they had once guarded their Führer. The symbol of power that had terrified Europe now became their grave. What emerges from these accounts is not random rage, but a systematic process. The Red Army acted with deliberation, carrying out an unofficial but widespread policy of extermination. They made no distinction between the frontline Waffen-SS and the camp guards. To the Soviets, they were all complicit, all guilty, all deserving of the same fate. Some historians have questioned the morality of such actions, asking whether it was justice or vengeance. But for the Soviet soldiers who had marched through their own ruined homeland, who had seen families slaughtered and entire cities turned to ash, the line between the two had long since disappeared. To them, vengeance was justice. And yet, even this was not the full extent of Soviet retribution. Beyond the battlefield executions and symbolic punishments, there awaited something darker still: the camps built specifically for the SS. Places where survival was not expected, where the sentence was not days or weeks, but slow death by starvation, disease, and endless labor. The question was no longer whether the SS would survive in Soviet hands. The question was how long they would endure before the machinery of retribution consumed them entirely. The war was ending, but the retribution was only deepening. The Soviet Union had no illusions about forgiveness. They carried the war in their bones, and every step into liberated territory revealed new scars. Burned-out houses, shallow pits filled with bodies, survivors too weak to stand, pointing trembling fingers at the men who had done it. Those men almost always wore the same insignia, the runes of the SS. By 1941, Soviet Order No. 270 had already drawn a hard line. All members of the SS were to be classified as war criminals. This meant that from the moment of capture, their fate was sealed. While ordinary German soldiers could hope, however faintly, for a return home, the SS had no such horizon. They were not considered prisoners of war. They were condemned men awaiting their punishment. This policy became reality in the special labor camps established across the Soviet Union. These were not camps designed for re-education, or even indefinite imprisonment. They were designed to erase the SS from existence. Rations were deliberately meager. Work was relentless, often in mines, forests, or frozen construction sites. Guards enforced punishments with brutal efficiency. Disease spread quickly through the ranks of the malnourished. For the SS, each day was not survival but prolongation of death. The numbers tell the story starkly. For German prisoners of war in general, the survival rate in Soviet captivity was estimated at around 38%. It was grim, but not absolute. For the SS, the figure plunged to less than 3%. Entire transports of captured men dwindled into nothing within months. Few ever saw a second winter. Even the process of identification was ruthless. Soviet intelligence officers carried detailed files on the SS divisions and their personnel, but they also relied on a simple and inescapable marker: the blood group tattoo. Every SS man bore a small tattoo under the arm, inked during his induction. It was meant to aid in battlefield medicine, ensuring quick transfusions for wounded soldiers. But for the Soviets, it became the perfect signature of guilt. When prisoners were herded together, Soviet guards would order them to strip. Shirts were pulled aside, sleeves rolled up. If the faint outline of a tattoo was visible, even scarred or burned, the decision was instant. That man was pulled away from the others. He would not return. Many SS soldiers tried desperately to remove the mark before capture. Some carved at their skin with knives. Others pressed burning cigarettes into the flesh to blur the ink. But scars betrayed them, and the Soviets were not easily deceived. Once identified, the treatment often followed a grim ritual. In certain camps, SS prisoners were forced to write letters to their families. These were not letters of hope, but confessions. Men were made to write of their crimes, of the villages they had burned, of the civilians they had killed, of the children they had shot. These letters were sometimes sent home, sometimes kept in Soviet files. They served as both documentation and final testimony. Execution often followed. Some were taken to nearby forests and shot in groups, their names recorded in what came to be known as death books, ledgers kept by Soviet officers listing each SS man eliminated. Others were worked to death, the execution carried out not by bullets but by hunger and exhaustion. A few were forced to labor until their strength was gone, then made to dig their own graves. There are accounts, too, of families being summoned. In certain cases, local villagers who had suffered under SS terror were brought to witness the end. The condemned were paraded before those whose homes they had burned, whose children they had killed. The Soviets turned the final moments into a form of public justice, a mirror of the atrocities committed years earlier. The message was unmistakable. The SS were not to vanish quietly into anonymity. Their erasure would be recorded, remembered, and tied forever to their crimes. And yet, the Soviet campaign did not stop with those captured during the war itself. Even after the guns fell silent, the NKVD and the dreaded Smersh carried the hunt forward. Teams scoured forests, villages, and cities, searching for those who had slipped through the cracks. Men who had shed their uniforms and tried to blend in with civilians, who had shaved their heads, hidden their tattoos, forged papers. They were pursued relentlessly, as if the war had not truly ended. One name stands out in this post-war pursuit: Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon. Though captured later and eventually tried in France, his path ran through Soviet hands. For him, as for so many others, there was no sanctuary. Smersh agents and partisan groups hunted the SS like prey across the ruins of Europe. By the end of 1945, the war was over, but for the SS, there was no peace. Those who were not shot at the front or worked to death in Siberia were tracked down and delivered into the hands of those who had lost everything to their crimes. The reach of Soviet retribution was long, and its grip unrelenting. Still, the full scale of this campaign was yet to be revealed. What happened not just to individuals, but to tens of thousands of SS men across Eastern Europe? What did the numbers say when the vengeance was tallied? The answer lay in statistics so stark, so overwhelming, that they spoke not only of punishment, but of a deliberate policy of elimination. The war had shattered Europe, leaving behind ruins, ash, and silence. Yet, even as cities began to rebuild, one chapter remained brutally unfinished: the reckoning with the SS. For the Soviets, this reckoning was not an afterthought, it was policy. Order Number 270 had declared the SS war criminals, and that declaration echoed in every prison cell, every transport, every execution site. What happened to these men was not random violence, nor the chaos of revenge carried out by mobs. It was systematic. It was deliberate. It was a state-driven campaign of annihilation. Special SS-only camps dotted the Soviet interior. These camps were different from the already grim facilities holding regular German prisoners of war. They were built as places of slow death. Work quotas were impossible to meet. Food rations were deliberately set below starvation levels. Guards did not merely enforce order, they enforced despair. Each day stripped away the pride of the once elite soldiers who had believed themselves destined to rule a continent. Now they shoveled coal until their hands bled, cut timber in forests where the temperature plunged far below freezing, or hauled stone until their backs broke. Survival was never the goal. The statistics reveal the intent. Regular German army prisoners, though suffering immense hardship, had a survival rate of about 38% in Soviet captivity. For the SS, that number collapsed to 2, sometimes 3% at best. Entire transports of hundreds dwindled to a handful within months. Some camps recorded no survivors at all. It was not only the camps that enforced this extermination. Soviet officers kept meticulous records in what came to be known as death books. Each SS prisoner executed or worked to death was listed, name by name, date by date. These were not chaotic killings. They were catalogued retributions, a bureaucratic mirror of the Nazi files that had once recorded their own victims. The process of identifying SS members was cold and efficient. Beyond documents and confessions, the most damning proof was still the blood group tattoo. It was a mark of pride when first inked, a symbol of belonging to the most feared organization in Europe. But in Soviet captivity, it became a death sentence. Even men who had deserted, even those who had served in supply roles rather than in combat, found that the tattoo bound them to the same fate. To the Soviets, there were no degrees of guilt. The SS, as a whole, was guilty. Some were given one final task before their end: writing letters. Prison guards handed them paper and demanded that they confess in their own words. They wrote of villages burned, of Jews and partisans shot, of prisoners herded into pits. Some begged forgiveness from wives and children. Others wrote defiantly, refusing to admit guilt even as they signed their own death warrants. The Soviets kept these letters as proof, as testimony, as a final record of crimes. There were moments when vengeance became public theater. Villagers whose homes had been torched were summoned to witness executions. Families who had survived mass shootings were allowed to see the perpetrators brought low. The condemned men were often forced to stand before these survivors, to face the eyes of those who remembered every atrocity. When the rifles fired, the Soviets made certain the witnesses saw justice done. And yet, the campaign extended beyond those already in captivity. SMERSH and NKVD units scoured the wreckage of Eastern Europe, hunting fugitives. They searched burned-out houses, forest hideouts, and city ruins. Some SS men tried to vanish into civilian life, shaving their heads, forging papers, even joining columns of displaced persons. But the Soviet net was wide. Informants whispered names. Tattoos betrayed secrets. One by one, they were dragged into custody. In some cases, captured SS men were not kept by the Soviets at all. They were handed over to partisans or local militias, groups that had suffered years of German brutality. These transfers often ended in immediate unrecorded executions. In Poland, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, the ground itself became the courtroom, and the verdict was always death. By the mid-1940s, the numbers painted a chilling picture. In Poland alone, more than 4,000 SS men were executed in 1945. Thousands more vanished in Hungary and across Czechoslovakia. Out of an estimated 50,000 SS soldiers captured by the Soviets in the final years of the war, fewer than 500 survived the camps and executions. The scale was staggering. It was not vengeance in isolated bursts. It was extermination on a mass scale, deliberate and absolute. Some might ask whether this was justice, or simply a mirror of the cruelty the SS themselves had unleashed. But to the Soviets, that question never mattered. They had buried too many dead, endured too many sieges, watched too many villages burn to ash. For them, retribution was justice. And they carried it out with the same relentless determination with which they had defended Moscow, fought at Stalingrad, and stormed Berlin. Still, the final chapter of this story had yet to be written. For even decades later, long after the war had ended, evidence of Soviet vengeance continued to surface. Hidden graves were discovered, filled with the remains of men who once believed they would rule forever. And in one such grave, a message was found that revealed the full weight of Soviet memory. What had begun as whispered rumors of no survivors would end with undeniable proof that the SS, once Europe's most feared force, had been almost completely erased. The war was over. Europe tried to move forward, to rebuild cities shattered by bombing, to bring families back to life after years of starvation and grief. Yet beneath the new foundations, beneath the silence of reconstruction, the fate of the SS lingered like a shadow. For decades, the full story was hidden, buried not only under rubble, but in archives sealed by the Soviet state. It was not until 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, that the final evidence began to emerge. In a basement in Berlin, during the chaotic reordering of files and properties, workers discovered a sealed room. Inside were the bones of dozens of men, their remains piled carelessly as though they had been discarded like trash. But these were not random victims of war. They wore the remnants of uniforms, fragments of the black cloth, once marked with skulls and lightning bolts. They were SS. Scattered among the bones was a note, written in Russian, left behind by those who had carried out the execution. It read, "For Leningrad, for Stalingrad, for every burned village." The message was clear. This was not simply killing, it was memory turned into judgment. Each name on those death lists, each bullet fired into the back of an SS prisoner, was meant as an answer to years of suffering. The dream of the SS had been a Reich that would last 1,000 years. In reality, it lasted only 12. And its end was not marked by dignity, nor by battlefield heroics, but by the silence of unmarked graves, by the erasure of an organization that had believed itself untouchable. The Red Army had seen to that. For them, there was no difference between vengeance and justice. The SS had written their sentence in fire and blood, and the Soviets carried it out to the last man. The statistics remain staggering. Out of approximately 50,000 SS men captured by the Soviets, fewer than 500 survived. The rest were executed, starved, or worked to death. They were hunted across Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Baltic states, and even within Germany itself. Entire transport trains disappeared into the east, never to return. Soviet death books kept their names, but the world never saw them again. Even Allied forces, at times, handed SS prisoners over to the Soviets, knowing full well what awaited them. Some were transferred quietly, away from the eyes of international law, delivered into the hands of those who had lost entire families to their crimes. What happened next was rarely recorded. Silence was the final curtain. And yet, the story is not merely about statistics or numbers. It is about a reversal of fear. For years, the SS had embodied terror. Villages trembled at the sight of their insignia, and millions lived and died under their brutal policies. But when the tide turned, when the Red Army marched west, that terror was returned in kind. The skull that once symbolized power became a mark of doom. The lightning bolts that once struck fear into civilians became a beacon for executioners. The SS believed they were the masters of life and death. In Soviet captivity, they discovered that their power had evaporated, leaving only the memory of their crimes. Their fate was not to vanish quietly into history books but to be hunted, erased, and condemned in the same brutal fashion they had once inflicted upon others. For decades, the Soviet Union kept these stories silent, hidden behind the Iron Curtain. But when the graves were uncovered, when the archives were opened, the truth emerged. The SS had not simply been defeated, they had been annihilated. It is a lesson carved into history. When terror is wielded without limit, when cruelty becomes policy, the reckoning will one day arrive. For the SS, that reckoning came at the hands of the very people they had sought to destroy. The 1,000-year Reich ended in 12, and in its final act, the SS found no mercy, no survivors, only Soviet justice. This is the story of power reversed, of fear transformed into vengeance, of hunters who became the hunted. The memory remains as a warning, a reminder of how quickly empires of cruelty can collapse, and how final their destruction can be when the world demands justice. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more untold chapters of history. Leave a comment below with the name of your city. We love seeing where our viewers are watching from around the world. And if you want to support our work, share this documentary so that the lessons of the past are never forgotten. Because history is not only about what was done, but about what must never be allowed to happen again.